been driving very fast. I saw Hank on the phone as I drove past. And so I pulled on over, said, Hank, how you been? He said he had to catch a train, and I said, jump in. Had to catch a train, and I said, jump in. Well, jump on in. Jump on in. Jump on in. Jump on in. Well, jump on in. Jump on in. They would jump on in. Well, I hadn't driven very far, and baby, I saw a shooting star, a vision straight out of the past. I wonder how long the dream will last. Well, I hadn't driven very far when Hank Williams got in my car. Said it'd be the last thing I'd ever see. Old Hank Williams sitting next to me. Hank Williams sitting next to me. We sang jambalaya. We sang about Kalijah, the wooden Indian.
Good morning, everyone. With all the events that have happened in Austin this March, I'd like for us to pause for just a moment for a moment of silence for members of our extended family who are grieving the death of loved ones and are praying for healing and recovery for those who have been injured. We also want to express gratitude to the men and women of the Austin Police Department, our public safety partners at the state and federal level. A moment of silence. In your mercy, hear our prayers. I want to thank you for being here. I especially want to thank the members of our community who have taken time out of their busy days to be present. I want to recognize my colleagues, Mayor Steve Adler, Councilmember Troxclair Tovo Kitchen, and representatives from Councilmember Alter's office. I almost didn't see you over there. Councilmember Alter's office. Participating this morning in the press conference will be Mayor Steve Adler, Senator Gonzalo Barrientos, and Robin Rather. It is a pleasure for me to recognize Walter Long, who is over there by the media, whose grandfather, Walter E. Long, was Secretary of the Austin Chamber of Commerce for 35 years and one of the supporters of the 1928 city plan. As we gathered today prior to the 90th anniversary of the 1928 plan, some ask, why is this remembrance important? It's important because it is a milestone, and it is our customary in our culture to acknowledge milestones, individually, in families, and in communities. This is such a moment in our community. It's important to inform and provide a context for neighbors, new and seasoned, regarding the significance of the 1928 plan in the history of the capital city of the state of Texas. And by doing so, people will begin to see their day-to-day lives, this community, through the lens of the 28 plan. People ask me, why now? Well, I'm looking forward to being around for another 10 years, but as we know, nothing is promised, so the time is now. This is difficult work to do, to be reminded of our past and reflect on and internalize the words, the intentions, and actions that intersect the realities of today, 90 years later. This council has acknowledged and taken action to highlight our awareness regarding institutional racism and systemic racism that permeates our society in subtle and not so subtle ways. For several years, city employees have attended a community engagement process entitled Undoing Racism Austin. In February, council members Alter, Flanagan, Poole, Tovo, and I, the mayor, attended the initial session participated in 2 days of Beyond Diversity training. Both trainings heightened our awareness of how insidious racism can be. The 1928 plan was mandated by an all-white, all-male city council to circumvent a 1917 Supreme Court ruling that zoning laws used to segregate the races were in fact illegal. The city funded the development of a plan to address the city's need to acquire property and to find a solution to segregate the fairly large population of freed slaves. The plan required that all Negroes relocate to the Negro district, except for individuals who worked as domestics and they were able to stay in Clarksville. The plan forced individuals, families, congregations, businesses to move, leaving behind homes, property, and any wealth that they had accumulated. City services such as utilities, schools, parks were provided to the displaced population only if they relocated. And that included poor people, people of color, and immigrants. The disparities and inequities have been a reality in many parts of East Austin for 90 years. As many of you know, I attended segregated schools here in this city, and so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about how that 1928 plan is still operational today. It took 2 federal court orders to integrate Austin schools after Valma Overton filed a civil lawsuit to desegregate the schools in 1970. The first order closed Elsie Anderson High School and Keelan Junior High in 1971. Then we instituted crosstown busing. That caused public school enrollment to decline, and the trustees blamed the court-ordered mandate to integrate as the cause of that decline. In 1980, crosstown busing stopped, yet a transfer policy was instituted so that attendance boundaries during the time of segregation were not enforced. Enrollment in Austin's private schools increased. In 1986, the school district, no longer under a court order, instituted the concept of neighborhood schools. In my community, that's called separate and unequal, because the racial segregation lines had been established in 1928. And again, that pattern continues today. So this proclamation on Thursday is to acknowledge this milestone in our collective history. It is to tell the story of our city and to remind our community of the importance of being aware of how our history impacts our present and ultimately our future. We must learn from the past. If not, we're doomed to repeat it. We must be intentional about how we work together to dissolve the silos that we live, work, play, and worship in. The reality is that we must strive to become a city worthy of the accolades that we have received. And with that, I turn it over to Mayor Steve Adler.
Councilmember Houston, thank you for your leadership on this issue, not only over the last 3.5 years on the council, but for decades before that. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm proud to be here with you and with my colleagues on the council. You know, almost 50 years ago, Lyndon Johnson went before Congress and gave a speech on civil rights. There is no Negro problem, he said. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. And today we are here to talk about an Austin problem. We still live with the legacy of the 1928 master plan, here now 90 years later. To not remember that plan and this anniversary would be a lie of omission about our city's past. The river of time carries that racism through our community today, in the form of many inequities, and we cannot clean that river without identifying where it was poisoned in the first place. The 1928 plan was not the first, nor was it the last official act by city government that unjustly divided our community. This history shocks us because we know we're good people. But for starters, we need to recognize that white settlers founded what became Austin in an area that was indigenous to the Tonkawa people. Slaves were brought here against their will, and the Confederate flag once flew over our state capitol right here in our city. Early Asian residents were denied the right to own property in our community. The 1928 plan itself would later be confirmed and extended to the Latinx population as recently as 1954. This week, in addition to marking the 90th anniversary of this plan, we are also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Fair housing, the right to live where one chooses, continues to be a long struggle in our city. We must remember both the times that our institutions have failed us, as well as when we seek to overcome those failures. And we're not here today just to talk about the past. We're here because we know that the choices we make today will become part of our history too. We recognize that today's racial and economic inequity is a consequence and not an accident. Close to a century after the 1928 plan, we find ourselves with the paradox of prosperity. While Austin ranks as one of the best places to live in the United States, it is also one of the most economically segregated, simultaneously ranking as one of the fastest growing cities in America and experiencing a decline in our African American population. There are dramatically different health outcomes based on where you live. Geography can affect how long one lives. And at its extreme, there is a shocking 21-year difference in the life expectancy between a zip code on the east side of town and where we have the high concentration of communities of color, and on the west side of town, that is mostly white. We know that infant mortality rates are higher for people of color, and the rate for African Americans is twice that of whites in our city. We know that 160,000 people live in food deserts in our city, and all live east of Mopac and nearly all east of I-35. We know that African Americans make up roughly 8% of our general population, but disproportionately make up 42% of our homeless population. On any number of measures, from unemployment to education outcomes, the racial and geographic division of our city is stark. Austin cannot be a great city if we do not confront these truths about ourselves. We cannot be a great city if some of our residents experience the violent crown, while too many others experience only the thorns. I believe that Austinites are good people. I know this because I have seen us take up the same tools that were used to divide us in the past and instead use them to bind up the city's wounds. Where a previous generation has divested in our communities of color, one of the first actions this council took was to initiate a process to reinvest through our Spirit of East Austin initiatives. Where a previous generation used Confederate names and symbols to intimidate, this council will take action this week to rename public streets for individuals who represent our values as a city. Where a previous generation had petitioned to add language to this city's charter barring benefits to domestic partnerships, this council has fought for and witnessed the full recognition of marriage equality for our LGBTQ community. And where untold generations before us have created an inequitable Austin, your city today resolves to create an inclusive, thriving, and holistic community for all of us. Time and again, whatever the struggle, I have seen the true Austin values of equity and inclusion win out. They must win out. They must begin to break the divisive cycles of the past. I am proud to be part of this great city of ours, for not hiding its flaws and for courageously confronting them. By remembering the 1928 plan today, we are showing that the city of Austin is able to acknowledge our past, to understand its impacts on our present, and perhaps most importantly, to choose a better future for ourselves and for our children. Ms. Houston, again, thank you.
My Senator, Gonzalo Barrientos.
Thank you. My fellow Austinites, a few brief words. I join Council Member Ora Houston, Mayor Steve Adler, Robin Rather in this remembrance of the 1928 city government action. I do this from my perspective of coming from deep East Austin. Actually, it was Bastrop, which at the time had similar human predicaments, shall I say, as were going on in Austin, indeed probably the many other cities and states. For example, in Bastrop, there were 3 schools when I started the first grade. One for blacks, one for whites, and one for Mexicans. Not for Mexico, us. I went to the Mexican school in that first grade, and we were integrated about 1948-49, the Mexican Americans. The African Americans were not integrated there until the 60s. Married right after high school, coming to the University of Texas. After that, Emma and I spent our years raising our family and working in public service, the civil rights movements, el Movimiento Chicano. In '65, interestingly, I worked as a community organizer for the National Urban League Project Enable in one of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs. From Clarksville to the East Side, Montoples, Booker T. Washington projects, trying to empower the East Side community. My boss was a wonderful professional mentor. Her name was Thelma Elliott. It was the mom of this lady here. After working for Vista Peace Corps, worked in Washington, D.C., the winds of change were causing coalitions. In Austin, African Americans and Hispanics, common problems, common needs, joined hands more than ever with each other and other groups here. Delco, Hancock, Trevino, Snell, Moya, Garcia, and others provided us more representation of the face of Austin. The dynamics of change were taking place. Not fast enough for some, too fast for others. What was happening? Gentrification, displacement. It is now 2018. I understand there's a code next. We must now, more than ever, work together, use common sense, join hands, and be sensitive to all. You know, it has been said, we are products of our past, but we must not be prisoners of it. God bless us, and thank you.
Robin Rather.
Across Austin, we share the values of fairness and justice. But are they just ideals? Are they in fact reality on the ground where it counts? Councilmember Houston, I appreciate your focusing on this old plan from 1928. It should be required reading for everyone who lives here or moves here, young and old. To understand systemic racism and economic segregation that exists in Austin today, we have to look back because it's still dramatically affecting us here 90 years later. It set up a pattern that's trapped us all. And that's exactly why the white men who created that plan did it. They knew it would go on and preserve their status quo, their patriarchy, their power, and their privilege. They did it on purpose. They did it on purpose. 90 years is such a long time. Most of the time these days, as individuals in Austin, we're not overtly racist anymore. But overt or not, intentional or not, the reality here in 2018 is too much the same. It's too much the same. Why is that? We have to ask ourselves, why is that? Part of it is we just forgot the past. We forgot it. Back in the 1990s, when I was a 3-time chair of Save Our Springs Alliance, then Mayor Watson and some out-of-town consultants suggested we adopt a planning policy called smart growth. It was supposed to be good for the economy, good for the environment, and good for equity, for fairness in people's lives. That's how it was said. But it wasn't. It wasn't good. It wasn't good for fairness in people's lives. Back then, nobody in Austin had ever heard of gentrification. It wasn't a word. No one understood it. But that smart growth policy set in motion an unprecedented degree of expensive density, and it started a vicious wave of displacement. That lasted for 25 years. It's still going on. We didn't intend that wave. No way did we intend that, but it happened. It happened and it extended the urban core. That's a planning term, the urban core. It extended the urban core as far east as 183. 183, that was never urban core. It was neighborhoods that were both very affordable and culturally essential to those who lived there. That should have never happened, but it did. Back in the 90s, there was no environmental justice for East Austin. Numerous landfills had been put there, industrial property was put there, watershed protections didn't exist east of I-35. The remnants of that 1928 plan that said people's lives in East Austin did not count the same as they did in West Austin, they were still in full effect, and perhaps even worse than they ever were. Some progress has been made. People like my friend Susana Almanza have worked really hard to bring environmental justice to our city. But it seems like every time we solve one problem, 5 more spring up to take its place. That's what's hard about this. Every time we think we've got something nailed back into place the way it should be, the wave keeps coming. It keeps coming. This is a pattern. It's a pattern that we need to disrupt. This town has so many tech innovators that know how to disrupt whole global industries. We have so many creative people, and most of all, we have so many people here whose lived experience has just not been listened to. We're just not listening to people who know exactly what they're talking about. We're blowing right past it, and we shouldn't be doing that. Martin Luther King said in 1967, We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. We've worked hard to be a green city. We've worked hard to be a boom city economically. We have all kinds of people moving here who don't know anything about our history. None of these are good enough excuses. I've apologized for my role, but apologies are not nearly enough. It's our responsibility right now to put people first, not real estate first. We need to conquer this immoral pattern. And I know we can do it. I know we're capable of it. I know if anyone can do it, Austin, Texas can do it if we work together and put our mind to it. We have to do this before we set up yet another destructive wave. We're so capable of it, we can stop giving racism and displacement just lip service and resolutions. That's what we've been doing. That's what we've been doing as recently, like yesterday we were probably doing that here. That's what we have to stop doing, just talking about it. We need to implement the solutions we know we need to do and fund those solutions, and we need to do it together. We're here today to ask you to get educated about this old 1928 plan and the pattern that has lasted all the way up to this very morning. Once you understand it, help us disrupt it, and let's innovate our way towards a person-oriented society that brings fairness and equality to Austin once and for all. Thank you.
I am so humbled by all of the comments that have been made by the mayor, Senator Barrientos, and Robin Rather about the city that we all call home and the city that we all love.